580 KUBC. David Justice is here with us today. David, I missed you last week.
Yeah, I miss you too. Thank you for serving this country.
Thank you for serving this country. Well, I needed a dose of David today. I got a double dose of David. I got David O. Johnson and David Justice. It's a great day today.
Well, great. It's a great day to be hanging out with you, Jim.
Thank you. Back at you, my friend.
I really loved your rant the last hour. Man, you were going off.
Well, we got to keep going. David, we've got somebody special on the line here with us.
We do. He's a good friend. Michael Bednarik, libertarian candidate for president several years ago, a front line patriot. He's a speaker at the Richard Mack Sheriff's Conferences. He's a friend of liberty, and he's a friend of this country. I could go on and on. His credentials are long. He's just written a book, The Secret to Sovereignty. And Jim, since you cornered me a few weeks ago to talk about this driver's license thing that a lot of people stumble around on, I gave Michael a call. He understands this, and I wanted to bring him into the conversation so that we can talk about solutions and remedies instead of just continuing to talk about problems. And Mike is a very solutions-oriented guy, and so I'm very proud to introduce my friend Michael Bednarik.
Michael, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me on.
Michael, we, as David has talked to you about, we have a very conservative audience, a very an audience. It's about a 45-plus demographic as a whole that have been brought up a certain way in this country, and we're struggling right now with a lot of stuff. We've been taught certain things. We've been brought through a system that taught us to trust the government, that taught us that our answers, that we lived in the United States of America and everything is going to be okay because we live in the United States of America. One of the things that we have a hard time wrapping our head around is, over the course of time, we have labeled people as radicals, as people who come out and are willing to stand up and say something that's foreign to what we've been taught, foreign to what we've always been raised with. And now we're starting to find out that these people that we thought were radical, all of a sudden are preaching something that we need to listen to. And I'd just like to have your comment on that, if you don't mind.
Well, if you do research on the etymology of the word radical, it means root. And the reason that the United States was such a wonderful country is because we're getting to the root of liberty. We had certain principles documented in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution that we actually lived from. And when people are allowed to own their own property, exercise their lives the way they want as long as they're not infringing on somebody else, then you have incredible, explosive prosperity. And it is only since we have stepped away from those principles that life in the United States is not what we would like it to be. The fact that we are struggling with we had a $1 trillion bailout in 2007, a $2 trillion stimulus package in 2008, the unfunded liabilities for the United States are approaching $100 trillion. And the only way we can get there is to violate the principle of, honest trade using gold and silver or commodities and printing up worthless, fraudulent Federal Reserve notes and spending worthless paper as if it was money.
You still there, Mike?
I think he muted.
Yes, I'm still here.
Okay.
So when somebody is labeled a radical, it is quite often because they are getting to the root of the problem, the root of the problem that we have long overlooked. And, somehow or other we have this idea that gravity doesn't exist in certain circumstances. That, it would be inconvenient here, so we're just going to ignore gravity. Well, anytime you ignore gravity, something's going to fall. And so we can't ignore these fundamental principles. Now, one of the fundamental principles is that, a person cannot cannot exist in two places at once. If you and David and I are having lunch and police officers show up and try to arrest me for a murder in San Francisco moments ago, we know that it's not possible. I couldn't be in San Francisco committing a murder and in Colorado, having lunch with my friend at the same time. So logic dictates that I couldn't possibly, have committed the murder in San Francisco. Now, this leaves the police with a bit of a problem. They do know that I didn't commit the murder, but that doesn't answer the question of who did. And so when we have these contradictions, one of them is true and the other one is false. Either I was having lunch or I was committing murder, but it couldn't be both. So as we investigate some of these things that your listeners are so confused about, they appear to be in contradiction to things that we have taken for granted. And it still is true. One of these is true and one of them is false. And the reason that people have so much difficulty is because the things that they have taken for granted for so long, they just assume that they are true. It turns out that in many cases, those are the things that are not true. Most people believe that the Declaration of Independence was signed on the 4th of July. That is not true. The wording was approved on the 4th of July. They had the document printed by a printer. They circulated it. Then they had a calligraphy version. And the Declaration of Independence was actually signed beginning August 2nd. Well, that is true, even though it conflicts with what people think they know. Most people think that George Washington was the President of the United States, first President of the United States. That is not true. George Washington became president in 1789, when the United States came into existence in 1776. Well, during those 13 years, between 76 and 89, we operated under the Articles of Confederation. We elected a new chief executive or president of the United States every year. So George Washington is the 11th president of the United States. He is merely the first president of the United States under the Constitution. So what most people hold to be true, they take it for granted, is not accurate. And once you start to investigate what the truth is, then you realize that most of us have been living in a version of Alice's Wonderland for many years.
Michael, question. I want to get into liberty versus license. One of the things that we've had a lengthy discussion about the last couple of weeks is the fact that David Justice does not have a driver's license, and he continues to fight to keep it that way. Tell us about your situation, and tell us and comment on. We have a lot of people that are saying, "Hey, that ain't right. We've got to. There's nothing wrong about having a driver's license. You should have a driver's license." Can you comment on that?
Well, I don't have a driver's license. I have not had one since 1997, and for many years it was my crusade to make the police department in Austin, Texas, miserable with my, complaints. So, the question really is based on rights and privileges. A right is something that you can do without asking for permission. A privilege is an authority that someone gives you, and they can take it away anytime they want. We, the people, created Congress. They work for us. And it's not the other way around. So, you have a right to think, you have a right to dream, you have a right to do whatever you want with your life as long as you're not hurting somebody else. You have a right to travel. You have a right to travel on a pogo stick, on a horse, by foot. You also have a right to travel in an automobile if that's the way you choose to do it. The government does not have the authority to convert a right into a privilege. They try, and in many cases they succeed, but they don't have the justifiable right to do that. How many of your listeners have a church permit? Probably none. None of your listeners have ever filled out a government form that allows them to exercise their religion. That's because freedom of religion is a right. And again, the government has no legitimate authority to convert the exercise of a right into a privilege. What is this government going to do? Say, okay, don't think about God? How can they stop you from thinking about whatever you want? And if you are thinking about God in contrast to their regulation, how would they know? How would they stop you? So, freedom of religion is a right, and there is no such thing as a church permit. Well, if you and your listeners do not require a church permit, then what makes so many people think that I require a concealed carry permit? How does the Second Amendment differ from the First Amendment? The answer is it doesn't. I have a right to life. I have a right to defend my life. And I have a right to defend my life with a gun if I think that's the most efficient way to do it. And 23,000 gun laws in the United States are unconstitutional. They don't apply to me. I won't listen to them. You know, the government cannot make it illegal for me to defend myself. That's nonsense. And, you know, that's exactly what is getting the population so stirred up these days. The current administration is marching full steam ahead with their gun control legislation. They will not be happy until they collect all the guns from all the civilians. That's their ultimate goal. And most people, whether they understand the philosophy and the principles behind it, know that that's really not something they want to have done. That's not acceptable. So let's discuss the travel. You know, I have a right to travel down the highway. The government works for us, not the other way around. Those roads belong to us. They were paid with our taxes. Now, the government does have the authority to regulate commerce. If, you know, some big trucking company is filling up, you know, their trucks and traveling back and forth across our roads, and they are making a substantial profit, we have, you know, justifiable authority to charge them some rent. You know, we can, you know, cause them to pay a certain percentage for the privilege of conducting commerce back and forth across the highway. That's a legitimate function. But if we are exercising our right to travel, you know, if you and I get into my automobile and we, you know, travel someplace for lunch and I don't charge you any money, then I am not a driver. You are not a passenger. And my beautiful Trans Am is certainly not a vehicle. Those are all legal terms. And we have, unfortunately, been fraudulently tricked into participating in a commercial activity, which is not actually true. Imagine for the moment that I go to Ace Hardware. I buy a ball-peen hammer. It is exactly like a million other hammers that Ace Hardware sells. And because I'm a student in high school and they're pumping me full of Ritalin, Prozac, and other psychotropic drugs, I come home and use the hammer to crush the skulls of the people that I used to live with. What do we call this hammer now? Well, everybody knows the hammer is a murder weapon. Now, how about the 999,000 other hammers at Ace Hardware? Are they also murder weapons? Do you walk into Ace Hardware and say, I'd like that 16-ounce murder weapon, please? Oops. The 999,000 other items are hammers, without a doubt. But your hammer has been given an additional legal label based on the way that it was used. Because that hammer terminate somebody's life, it is still a hammer. But it is now also a murder weapon. And that label is special for that device based on the way that it was used. Does that make logical sense to you?
Yeah, I'd like to play the devil's advocate for just a moment on the hammer gun issue. Let's say, the hammer is manufactured for a certain purpose. A gun is manufactured for several purposes. Should you have to pass a course that says that you can safely use a gun before you can go out and purchase a gun? Or the other side of this is, when driving a vehicle, should you have to pass a driving course before you can exercise that privilege and right to drive a car?
Well, I will answer the question no, fully aware that your listeners will be shocked and horrified. But I'll save the logic and the reasoning for that a little bit later. I just want to establish whether people understand that the ball-peen hammer can have an additional label based on the way that it was used.
Yes, we don't get that.
If you use it improperly, it is a murder weapon. Now, let's take another object, the automobile. You know, all of these automobiles are coming off the assembly line in Detroit. All of them are automobiles. Is it possible that while all of them are automobiles, that unless you use that item to transport goods or passengers for hire, unless you are using that automobile for commerce in some way, that it does not retain a legal label called vehicle? But if I fill my car or my truck with boxes and I, transport these boxes and somebody pays me for the transport, that is commerce. And that truck or automobile for that time frame becomes a vehicle. And vehicles are under this commercial code. However, if we get into my automobile, we travel out to lunch, I don't charge you any money, we are not engaged in commerce. We are exercising our right to travel. And if you were to say, open up my toolbox and say, oh, Michael, this is a very nice murder weapon here, I'm going to be upset. I don't want you calling my tools murder weapons. That suggests a crime that I did not commit. In a similar way, I don't want you looking out the window and admiring my Trans Am and saying, Michael, that's a beautiful vehicle. I'll be upset because my Trans Am is not engaged in commerce. And I don't want to be interpreted as having engaged in commerce. It is a legal distinction, which is very important to David and I. It is a legal distinction that most people don't make. Now, if a police officer pulls me over on the side of the road and he wants to see my driver's license, tell him I don't have one. Why not? Well, because I don't need one, don't want one. Why not? Well, because I'm not engaged in commerce. In my first book, To Be King, I have a small section which discusses the definitions for a lot of the words. And I don't have my book with me, but transportation is, traffic is the transportation of goods or passengers. And I can't remember all these things, but every single definition that comes out of the traffic code is a commercial definition. If you're not engaged in commerce, then you're not required to have a driver's license. It is the commerce which is regulated by the government, not the right to travel. And let me just give one further example. If I show you a photograph of a man and woman with no clothes on in a very compromising compromising submission, can you tell whether this is the husband and wife on their honeymoon or whether this is rape? Looking at the picture, you can't tell because the actions are similar. But it is only rape if, there is no, willing consent. If the two people are performing this activity willingly and of their own volition, then, okay, no problem. But if one of these people is forcing, intentions on the other, that is rape. And it is that subtle distinction which makes one of them a crime and the other one not.
So this is really a critical. We're getting ready to go to the news here in just a minute, but I wanted to sum up. You're making a distinction between a privilege and a right. You're making a distinction between license and liberty. You're making a distinction between use, the use of, say, a hammer, and the use of a vehicle, and that distinction in the use is what you're emphasizing right now. Is that my understanding?
Absolutely. And these definitions and these distinctions are incredibly important. And, the lawyers and judges and police officers, well, the judges and lawyers usually do know the distinctions. They don't care. The police officers, I will give many of them credit for not knowing the distinction. They've been taught a certain way, and they are quite literally doing what they've been taught. But that doesn't make anything less wrong. We have a right to travel. Now, most people don't understand that right, are not willing to stand up for that right, but that doesn't negate the fact that we have the right. Many people will not defend themselves in a confrontation. If they are in a dark alley and somebody points a gun at them and demands their wallet or their purse, most people are going to be submissive. They're going to turn over their money. And, as far as I'm concerned, they're very likely to be shot and killed even after they turn over their money because, they're a living witness. They can identify the perpetrator. And these days, people don't like to be sent to jail for theft. So they would rather kill you and walk away. They'd rather be guilty of murder and not caught than guilty of theft and put in jail. So, David and I are admittedly a small percentage of the population. We have studied the issues. We understand the terminology. We understand the distinctions. And, we consider ourselves to be men of integrity and men of principle. And we feel that it is worth the discomfort and the trouble that we go through in order to promote the truth and to defend our rights.
Michael, we've got to run to the news, but I have one quick question. For example, the difference between use and privileges. If we have a rifle and we're going to use that rifle to hunt, then what you're saying is, if I'm getting this right, is then if we're required to take a hunter safety course to use that rifle to hunt, to buy a hunting license, then that is something that's okay. But if we're required to register that gun or have license to that gun just to own a gun, then that's not. Is that kind of a comparison?
Well, it's a comparison, but I don't necessarily believe that people should be registered or required to take classes to hunt. If you don't take a hunter safety class, you're probably going to go hungry because you're not going to hit the target. And I am, in general, not in favor of the government using compulsory force to condition society.
Okay. Well, I want to thank you for joining us.
No, let's keep him on. I think we should keep him on.
Okay, you have time to stay on with us?
I certainly do.
Okay, all
I'm
right.
here for another half hour.
Oh, thank you. Cool. But first, before we go to the news, we're going to go to that in just a second. You have a book out called Secret to Sovereignty. Can you tell us about that while we're waiting for the news?
I have been teaching a Constitution class for almost 15 years, and at the end of the class, people ask me, how do I travel without a driver's license? How do I carry a gun without a permit? And I don't give legal advice. All I can do is tell people what I do. So this book, Secret to Sovereignty, or How to Survive the Second American Revolution, is more of a personal history of my experiences with law enforcement, traveling without a driver's license, and, my attitudes towards the Second Amendment. And whether people follow my advice and example is completely up to them, but they can obtain the book by visiting my website, which is constitutionpreservation.org.
Okay, we're going to talk more about that when we come back. Michael, thanks for joining us. We're going to take a quick break and go to the news. You're listening to the Red Barn Steakhouse, Montrose Uray, and San Miguel Farm Bureau Trading Post. We'll be right back after the news. Welcome back. Red Barn Steakhouse, Montrose Uray, and San Miguel Farm Bureau Trading Post. David Justice, thanks for hanging in there with us.
My pleasure.
Yeah. Michael, thanks for hanging in there with us. We're finally back. David, go ahead.
Michael, you during the break, you went into the contractual nature of the contract. Could you discuss how that changes the relationship that the people have with the government when you enter into that type of contract, and explain the nature of what that contract is?
The only way that the government can compel a person to do something is if they are under contract. If David signed a contract in order to paint my house for a sum of money, if I've already paid David and hasn't painted the house, I can get the government to compel him to uphold his part of the contract. And, they can either force him to paint the house or deprive him of some property so I can get my original money back. So what most people are unaware of is the commercial nature of driving. And when you go down to the DMV and you get your photo taken, they always have you sign the back of your driver's license. And that's because you have just contractually agreed to participate in this, commercial structure. And for the privilege of being allowed to transport goods or passengers for hire, you are obligated to stop at the red lights, not travel faster than the speed limit signs, to follow all of these traffic rules. Now, you may argue that, well, I'm not carrying any goods or passengers for hire. Well, from the government's point of view, that's your problem. If you are a poor businessman or a poor businesswoman and you have failed to take advantage of this opportunity to make money, that's your problem, not theirs. But the fact is that you have entered into a contractual agreement with the government, unbeknown to you, which is where the fraud comes in. There is no, knowledge beforehand of what's actually happening. And this is the way the government gets us into lots and lots of contracts. How many people would voluntarily give up all of their natural, God-given, unalienable rights in exchange for government privileges, which may or may not actually happen? Well, nobody in their right mind would do that knowingly and willingly. However, if you have a Social Security number, you got that number by signing a contract with the government and basically waiving all of your rights in exchange for government protection and privileges. And, nobody ever told us. I got my Social Security number when I was 16. I was thrilled to death to have my first job. I was making $1.25 an hour, and I thought that I was rich. little did I know that, I had just, adopted a contract with the government. So I have since terminated that agreement, and I live my life as a free man. I don't let the government tell me what to do, and that doesn't mean that, I run around, maliciously hurting people. I was a Boy Scout for 12 years. Trustworthy is the most important, rung of the Scout work. And in most cases, I am helping people rather than hurting them. But I won't let the government come along and coerce me into doing something. I will not be compelled by some government edict to do something which is, not only a violation of my rights, but not in my own best interest.
Now, I've mentioned the Ashwander Doctrine on the air before, and it's, as I understand it, when you enter into some sort of agreement with the government through contract, it changes the nature of the government within the scope of that relationship. Could you expound a little on that?
That's true. The stuff that we learned in school about we elect our representatives and they go to Washington, D.C. to, basically make the United States wonderful. They are acting under a privilege. They have special authority granted to them by the office that they hold. However, when the government enters into a contract with you, then the government has no special authority. They become just like everybody else under a contract. And if they are violating the contract, they can be sued in jail just like everybody else. And so what happens is that we mistakenly, unknowingly, sign these contracts with the government, which gives us a lot of liability that we were unaware of. And we also fail to understand that the government has just now lost a significant amount of their authority. We still hold the government in high esteem. That's because, we are good, law-abiding citizens. And we assume, incorrectly, that the government is operating the way that it's supposed to. But, clearly it's not. I mean, how many times have we heard stories of police officers using the authority of their badge to, abuse a prisoner? I'm in Chicago right now. I mean, we've had so many cases here. We had a group of Chicago police officers walk into a bar, and they were, physically rousting everybody and basically shaking them down for money. And what they didn't know is that there was a security camera that caught all of it on video. There's another police officer who was off duty and was getting drunk. So the bartender tried to cut him off, and this big, burly police officer went behind the bar and beat the crap out of this little tiny female bartender, and now he's going to jail for a long time. So, I mean, there's a long history of people, abusing the legitimate power that they have, and, that something needs to be done about that. But, there is such a widespread acceptance of it that, people in authority get away with a whole lot.
Michael, we have about 3.5 minutes left. I have a question for you. Let's say that I'm a farmer and I have received a grant from the federal government to help me put underground pipe into my irrigation ditches. Now, let's say that the Gunnison sage grouse does hit the endangered species list. Let's say that my private land falls into that area where they consider that habitat. Does the federal government have the right to come in, since I have received federal monies for a project, to tell me that my land falls into that where they have new regulations about the sage grouse and habitat being on my private land?
Well, yes, for that and several other reasons. But, we have granted the federal government so much authority over, and doing it unknowingly, that the federal money that you've accepted from them is, there are strings attached. There's a true story about George Bernard Shaw goes into a bar, sits down next to an attractive woman, and after buying her a drink, he asks if she would be willing to have sex with him for $1 million. She gets flustered and says no, he probably doesn't have the money. He convinces her that he is George Bernard Shaw. He does have $1 million in, spendable money, and she eventually agrees. His next question is, would you have sex with me for $5? She says, I will not. What kind of woman do you think I am? And his response is, we've already established what kind of woman you are. Now we're negotiating a price. It doesn't matter how much money you get for selling your integrity. You're still a prostitute. And it really doesn't matter how much money you get from the government. Basically, you've made yourself a slave. And, it's like being pregnant. You're either pregnant or you're not. You can't be just a little bit pregnant. You can't be just a little bit of a slave to the federal government. Either you're a slave or you're not. And David Justice and I intend to not be slaves under any condition.
Michael, we've got to run. I thank you so much for hanging in there. Great stuff. And could we get you back on again someday?
Absolutely. Give me a call.
Thank you. And I want to take people to your website again. That's constitutionpreservation.org. Is that correct?
That is correct.
constitutionpreservation.org. And you can also see how to get his book, Secret to Sovereignty. Michael, thanks for joining us, and you have a wonderful day.
Thank you. Thank you, David.
Thanks.
Talk to you later.
Thanks, Mike. Appreciate you a lot.
Bye-bye. Good stuff.
So, wow.
Good
so
stuff.
I'm not the only radical out there.
Yeah, there are a bunch of radicals out there.
No, that opens up. I wanted to bring Mike on to open up the conversation since we're going to go down this road. That was a good foundational entry. We'll get back to it next week.
All right. We got to run.
All right.
Thank you
Thanks for having me, Jim.
Would like to talk to him again sometime.
Okay.
All right. David Justice, God bless you. Have a safe trip home,
I
okay?
will. Thank you.
All right. We got to go. We'll be back tomorrow on the Red Barn Steakhouse, Montrose Ray and San Miguel Farm Bureau Trading Post. Have a great day. Wow. That's good stuff. That's good stuff. So, did you ever have a Social Security?
Mm-hmm.